Thanks for taking out half an hour on a nice balmy Tuesday afternoon here in Washington, D.C. Hopefully we can get you some useful content here in a short amount of time and get you walking away with a couple of valuable insights, or at least definitions, or maybe even a little bit of humor here and then. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started with Frakture 101. Let's see. Okay, so our agenda for today should be short and sweet. We're going to go to a first Frakture, what and why now. We're then going to cover some basic definitions as we know them in Frakture, so we're all kind of on the same page. There's a quick section on kind of what warehousing overall and automated warehousing in particular, what's it good for. We're then going to go through a couple frequently asked questions about bots and warehousing and Frakture itself. Then we'll have a quick Q&A. I expect about 20 minutes or so of content here, followed by about 5 to 10 of question and answer, depending on how many questions we've got for this. If you guys do have any questions, there is a webinar chat in the Zoom app, which you can go ahead and ask questions in. I'll be keeping an eye on that. May not respond to right off the bat on the chat, but I'll respond in voice for any questions that you might have. Feel free to ask questions. We can have a good feedback going. I'll try and keep us paced pretty well, but we should we can field questions throughout as they come up. So getting into the meat of the content. Oops, that's not what I'm looking for. There we go. Okay, first off, what is Frakture? This is kind of a one-liner. Frakture is a data warehouse populated by an army of bots. We're going to cover both what a data warehouse is and bots and kind of Frakture overall. So it'll give this definition of what Frakture is some context. We're a technology platform, if that wasn't clear to those joining. But fundamentally, we operate as a warehouse with a bunch of bots working in and amongst that data warehouse. I think the more interesting question when getting into what and why Frakture exists is how we came about. So I come from the CRM world, the nonprofit technical CRM world, working with email communications, online advocacy, online fundraising, offline fundraising. And one trend that I kind of saw pretty aggressively pick up in the last 5 years, particularly the last 10 years, is the number of communications channels that we've had to deal with. It used to be that you could do a direct mail site, you could have your CRM, you could have an email program, and maybe a phone calling program, maybe a on-the-ground program, and you'd be good to go. But now comms teams, communications teams have to deal with social media. You've got to do Facebook and Google and Twitter. You have to do online ads. You get your Facebook ads, your Google ads, your display ads. You've got to do mobile communications, whether it be blast mobile communications, whether it be peer-to-peer communications. You've got to deal still with your direct mail programs and your website and online fundraising tools. Basically, the number of technologies that we as communications folks and fundraisers need to deal with has grown up exponentially. But we don't have the number of people to deal with it. Quick question from Jeff. We will absolutely send us the presentation. We'll try to do it after the call. I apologize for that, but we'll get you guys the presentation after the call, and then you guys can follow along with the video if you guys want to replay this. So we realized at Frakture that the number of humans in any given department was not going to go up, whether it be a fundraising department or communications department, marketing, sales, you name it. So in order to deal with all these new channels, we needed kind of a new way of thinking. So Frakture represents using digital automation to assist and help humans communicate amongst the broad variety of channels that exist and deal with all of the repercussions therein, the data repercussions, et cetera. So that's kind of why Frakture exists, to try and help organizations deal with the massive influx of channels and data that they now have to deal with. We'll get into how we do it in a second, but that's kind of one of the reasons why Frakture does exist. But first, we need some definitions. So first and foremost, there's what are bots? And I think everyone's got kind of a sense of bots, but for the purpose of Frakture, I wanted to describe what are Frakture bots and what are they not. So you guys know of robots and other such things through like Tesla and other auto companies deploying robots to help build manual labor. So let's refer to those as normal robots. These are things which are turning screws, widgets, helping people with any manual or physical labor. There's what we call chatter bots. So this has been very popular the last 3 or 4 years. Facebook put out a bot platform. Amazon lets you spin up bots in 2 or 3 minutes flat. Google has a bot infrastructure as well. We kind of globally term these chatter bots. They're very interactive, back and forth between a human being and a bot. Think online chat or Facebook Messenger, where you're interacting with a bot on the other end. It's not the only type of bot in existence, but it is pretty common these days, but we call those chatter bots. There's also groups like what we call Frakture bot digital bots, or bots that automate processes. This is more where the Frakture camp lives, but digital bots are things that help humans automate digital tasks in the same way that robots might help humans automate physical tasks. So a lot of what we talk about is the difference between chatter bots and digital bots. Not really much conceptual difference other than strategically you usually deploy a chatter bot if you're helping somebody navigate their way through a website or to fundraise, do advocacy, whereas you might employ a data bot or digital bot to automate a task that previously what you were unable to do as a human for either technical or time reasons. And then there's vendor who's useless. So next up is what is a warehouse? Again, just like bots, there's a lot of different definitions of what a warehouse is, both the physical aspect of a warehouse, obviously, but we're talking about a data warehouse that is in a database, essentially, in the system. At Frakture, we term a warehouse a vendor-agnostic database with information from many different platforms and many different channels going into and out of that warehouse. So it's not just the core warehouse. Something like Amazon Redshift, they argue as a warehouse. It's mostly just a data store. We call that place to dump data, et cetera, but it has very little structure. When we think of a warehouse, we think of a structured warehouse with ways to get data into and out of it. So when we term Frakture warehouse, that's the world that we're living in. There's many great other groups who use the word warehouse. It's a pretty common phrase, especially in data work. When we talk about Frakture, that's what we're talking about, a structured data database with mechanisms to get data into and out of that database very quickly. Typically, it'll be on a platform such as, again, Amazon's Redshift or Aurora databases, MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, Postgres. Any of these core databases support warehousing. In fact, at Frakture, all the ones I mentioned, we support a warehouse built on those technologies. But at its core, as a warehouse, we think of it as a vendor-agnostic database. So even Frakture-agnostic. So meaning that we can call a warehouse somebody's third-party hosted database that's running a SQL Server instance in-house. We would also term a warehouse. So it gets a little into the weeds, but if you can think of a warehouse as just a place that's not your CRM, it's not your CMS, it's not your emailer, it's not your fundraising database, it's not really any of those. It exists independent of all the different technologies, the warehouse, the platforms that are out there. We're going to see in a bit why that's valuable, that vendor agnostic area is there, but for the purposes of the definition, that's what we think of as a warehouse. So what are Frakture bots? So specifically, Frakture bots are the type of bots that are digital bots, so not chatter bots. We don't deal with people coming to a website and trying to get your phone service through Verizon. That's not us. The bots that we're talking about are digital bots that automate processes that typically humans are doing, typically in the arena of data aggregations, communications data, payment data, fundraising data, and interacting with third-party systems and the warehouse. So a common phrase some of the geeks on our team use is ETL, extract, transform, load. So a lot of our bots are ETL bots. So they know how to log into Razor's Edge. They know how to log into Luminate or log into any one of 100 other systems, pull the data out, clean it up, transform it, load it into structured data into a warehouse, and then operate on the data in that warehouse. So it's moving these records in and amongst outside platforms, and the warehouse itself. Oftentimes, this amount of data is huge. So whether the data is via, we often deal with the hundreds of millions of records scale, all the way down to like the tens of records. But the bots have a real value at scale. So especially mid to large size organizations deal with transaction histories of millions of records, and they can move the data in and amongst that system. We got a good question from Jeff San Marco. Can we tailor the schema in the warehouse? Yeah, the bots need a particular slice of the schema, but they don't need the whole warehouse. So oftentimes when we pull data down into a warehouse, the bots know how to structure it into a couple predefined schemas that they understand. So messages and people and transactions and a couple things that we understand. Otherwise, they're not going to know how to deal with the warehouse. That said, though, they don't need to own the whole warehouse. So a lot of our groups will take the data, that raw data feed from the bots, will create views, will create subqueries, will create tables on top of that. So the bots are responsible for knowing their little slice of the warehouse, but they may not be involved in the overall warehouse. So good question, Jeff. So you can absolutely tailor the schema of the warehouse. In our position, it's your warehouse. The bots do need their own little slice of it to be there, so they know how to push data into and out in that kind of raw format. Once you do it, what you do with it after that is up to you. That said, there's some value to the bots. A lot of the value of the bots is standardizing different technologies. So whether you're using, again, Team Approach or Razor's Edge or Salesforce or Illuminate or Salsa or any platform out there, the bots are going to understand what a person, what a heartbeat, what an actual identity is in those systems, and translate and transform that so that the warehouse doesn't need to know the specifics that Salesforce calls it a contact and Salsa calls it a supporter, right? The warehouse just calls it a person. So that standardization is hugely valuable because it allows you to treat the data independent of the vendor that's got the platform on that. So I hope that answered that question, Jeff. Good question on the schema. We'll cover some more schema stuff a little bit later if we want to get into that level of detail. But one of the things I wanted to make sure I covered is what's it good for, right? You're like, dang it, yet another technology, right? Now we have yet another technology in our stack of technologies that we have to work with. Well, the value of an automated warehouse is basically living in that arena between technologies, because we've got to use all these other technologies. We're never going to get away from having to have a website or have online ads. Facebook may die at some point, but there's going to be somebody else who's on in that social media arena. But the warehouse tries to extract the value from a lot of these different areas so that you as an organization can operate with these different technologies, no matter what technologies you might use. I'm going to go through a couple examples here. So there's about a half dozen areas I'm going to cover. There's lots more, about what it can be valuable for, but these are the ones I'm going to cover. I'm going to start on the right-hand, the left-hand side, the centralized data cleaning and flagging, and go counterclockwise around there. So for each of these, I'm going to give an example or explain it and kind of an example of how we're doing it with some of our clients now. So centralized data cleaning and flagging. If you guys have been doing a lot of online work recently, you know that managing opt-out messages across a bunch of different people is kind of a pain. Let's say you have an event system, an email system, and maybe a separate CRM where you're supposed to track all your data. Keeping in sync that information about whether or not someone's opted out is kind of a pain. In fact, without a warehouse solution, you have to connect all those wirings together. So for a lot of our groups, for like Greenpeace and Rock the Vote and a bunch of other One Campaign, we'll go ahead and manage and centralize that opt-in, opt-out status and be able to synchronize whether someone's opt-in to mobile, opt-in to email across all systems at once, regardless of where that data came from. Really useful for canned spam stuff, but also really useful for GDPR. I don't know if there's any GDPR folks on the call. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this is that new European privacy regulation that's going into effect in the next few weeks. In this new privacy world, you need to track who's been authenticated, who's given data in many different scenarios. So GDPR is a great example of where a warehouse becomes useful. Also, cleaning becomes really useful, making sure that you can clean and scrub your list, whether it be from bad emails or old physical addresses, or just capitalization or curse words. Sometimes people just enter in curse words into web forms, and cleaning them out through your list can be a pain in a lot of different systems. With the warehouse strategy, though, you can do that all at once. So for American Diabetes, we do a lot of data cleaning and merging, deduping. All that can be done much easier in a warehouse where you have control rather than the 5 or 10 separate systems you're using. Reporting. Reporting is an extremely valuable part of a warehouse. By definition, a warehouse has information on all the technologies you're using. So suddenly cross-channel reporting goes from being a pain, being able to see the performance of your direct mail versus your email versus your social media, becomes from going a pain to being arguably very, very easy. We support a bunch of reporting suites layered on top of the warehouse, things like Tableau, Power BI. We've had a bunch of organizations use. Google has a new reporting suite that's great. The warehouse is relatively agnostic about what reporting suite you're using. At Frakture, we have some dashboards which we kick out to groups. But fundamentally, reporting in a warehouse world simplifies dramatically how you end up doing reporting work. Amnesty International, we kick out dashboards for, and they also run a Tableau instance on top of their warehouse that lets them see cross-channel reporting, how their field teams are doing across on signing up people, and how those people are doing long-term on their fundraising. So reporting is a big deal in some of the warehouse worlds. Attribution, again, becomes pretty valuable, being able to take in a transaction. So one of the things we're doing with Mothership right now, which is a digital agency here in DC, they did Doug Jones, a bunch of other candidates, high-profile candidates. We'll do real-time attribution, whereby a transaction will come in via ActBlue, and it'll come into the warehouse, and then using a series of views and jobs, we'll attribute that to either one of the multiple email programs that they use or to their social media or their ad buys, so they can know either real time or within an hour what's performing. To that end, they send 7 or 8 emails a day because they're so hyper optimized with attribution, multi-channel attribution, that they can know the performance of different channels and change money allocation within minutes or hours. So a fantastic example of where warehousing can radically optimize and change how you behave to make it much more efficient and much better for the donor experience. Mothership, again, recently found out that one of their clients might be having some spam list problems for the email. Well, without a warehouse, trying to move an organization to a new movement to a new email program, really a pain. Let's say you've got a 1 million person list and you're like, man, I'm not sure about deliverability. You can either bite the bullet and move your whole list over, or you can export and import data to try and figure out whether new systems will work for you or not. Again, tracking opt-in, opt-out is a pain. But with the warehouse, you can swap in a new email system, and literally they were up and running in an hour. They decided to plug in and try a new email system, I think either a Cheetah Mail or one of the newer ones, MailChimp, I think, and test against that new system to test delivery rates, to test open rates, click rates, conversion rates against a new email platform to make sure that the email system they were using was the most efficient and effective. That's easy with a warehouse. Without it, it is a manual pain to manage and work with that. And it's also extremely risky trying to manage those opt-outs. Cross-channel targeting. With the One Campaign, we do cross-channel targeting whereby we, in the warehouse, coordinate data from one of their email CRM systems versus one of their systems that they actually run in Europe for opt-in, opt-out. We are able to pull that into the warehouse and push targeted Facebook custom audiences based on data from 2 or 3 separate systems. We have one other question from Jeff here. This is data coming in via file transfer. Yes, we have the types of bots we have. Jeff, I'm going to cover that during the FAQ. We've got a low listing of the types of bots and how we get data. So I'll cut to that question when we get to the FAQ. Cross-channel targeting, again, pushing targeting segments into email. One of our other groups, Children's National Hospital, pushes targeting segments based on direct mail history into their email program. So they can email offline donors and try to get them to move online. Average gift online, I just found out this morning, is $65. Average gift offline is $44. You want to do everything you can to move your offline donors online as fast as possible. And key to that is being able to target your offline donors with online mechanisms. Really hard to do without a warehouse. With the warehouse, quite straightforward. Lastly, what it's good for, the exploring new channels. So I mentioned a little bit with the email, but one of the reasons people aren't trying things like Hustle or some of the mobile technologies or even Facebook ads or even some fairly obvious technologies is it's a pain, right? You got to spin it up. You got to not only do the creative, but then you got to figure out how it's going to work, right? You got to figure out how to either source code the messaging going out, how to track the data coming back in, how it works into your reporting, how to get it back into, say, a legacy CRM system. So because of that huge hurdle to incorporating it into the system, people don't try. So, it's a shame how many groups have not fully adopted online ads, Google ads, Facebook messaging, Pinterest, peer-to-peer, mobile tactics. These are all tactics that groups should be using, but they don't because it's such a pain. With warehousing, it becomes dramatically easier. Not instant, it's not one click, but it becomes dramatically easier to worry less about the data and the feeding and the pushing and pulling of the data and the information and focusing on the creative. So you can get a creative designer in to do some Pinterest stuff for you and actually know how well it does without having to worry about the rest of the elements. So that's a lot of kind of what it's good for, but I'll move on from those and go quickly through some FAQs. So first, will bots take my job? No, they will take the crappy parts of your job. Hopefully the bits that are not valuable to your career. In general, bots don't do types of work that are valuable, not recreatable. By definition, they don't. So typically it's the crappy parts of the job, the import, export, the file stuff. Often we get the question, so Frakture, you guys on my data? It's like, nope, we are absolutely agnostic to where the warehouse can live. People who are tech savvy, we recommend just host their own warehouse. Super easy on Amazon or Google these days. Just spin it up. The bots will push data into your own warehouse. We're firmly in favor of that mechanism because it doesn't give you all of that. The Frakture itself, we charge, we base the number of platforms you end up using. Usually around 1,000, usually starts around 1,000 a month up to around 7 or 8K a month, depending on the number of bots we have. That gives you guys a little ballpark. In some cases, that's extremely, that allows people to free up 4 or 5 staff or up to 10 staff for some of our agencies work. In that case, otherwise it's often valuable to add in new channels. So we definitely don't go down into like the 100, 200 a month, but just to give you guys ballparks about what we typically talk about. And this gets to Jeff's question, what platforms do we have bots for? Well, we have about 120 bots now. And these are platforms you've heard of, the Team Approach, the Razor's Edge. We do direct file transfers through FTP, SFTP. We can VPN into systems. We can pull down files. One of our groups right now emails us an Excel file. Get that, just a straight Excel file. The bots pull in that Excel file, unzip it, read through the Excel, load it into a database table. We then kick that out to a dashboard to them, and all that happens in under a minute. We also do some of the bleeding edge ones, things like Stripe, Hustle. Basically, if it's out there and it's in use by particularly nonprofits or agencies, we're working with it or have a bot in process for it. Usually takes us about 3 to 5 weeks to put together a bot if it's not already one in place, but most systems that people use right now, we have a bot for. Okay. That is the extent of the questions I have. Jeff, hopefully I'll cover a little more detail on the file transfer. The data via files is a huge thing for us. In fact, automating direct mail files is one of our biggest business lines for some of our agency work. So because it is such a manual process of pulling a file down, loading it up, transferring the columns, cleaning the data up, getting it into a useful format, it's extremely menial and nobody really likes doing it. Yes, we can decrypt it. So we do all different types of decryption or encryption algorithms. If it's out there, we can decrypt it. It brings up an interesting point. Our biggest challenge at Frakture here is often getting access to the systems that people work with. So different vendors, and I won't mention any specifically, it's hard to get data into and out of. That is not a problem with the bots or the problem with that. It's a lot of the vendors don't prioritize data access. So that tends to be our limiting factor, is whether or not the technology, we can access it, whether we can get data out typically in bulk, and whether we can get a login or permissions to through an organization. Those are our typical challenges. Again, if you guys have some other questions, we can webinar chat them. We've got about 3 minutes here for follow-up and Q&A on this front. Identifying errors, often we identify an error in a file, we'll kick it to a Google spreadsheet. We love Google spreadsheets. They are a fantastic way for bots to work alongside human beings. So if we get in data that is error data, we can either error the whole file, or you can kick the errors to a Google spreadsheet for human interface to figure out how to work with them. We've tried to come up with a term. We've come up with magic spreadsheets, because there's nothing like watching 3 bots and 3 humans work together on a Google spreadsheet. That's a bunch of fun. Okay, good. Any other questions? Ashley, is there anything I forgot to mention through the course of this? All right. Great. We'll give another minute or two as people consider questions. If you want to reach out to us, go ahead and ping me at chris@frakture.com, also info@frakture.com, or ashley@frakture.com, and we'll get right back to you. Other than that, I appreciate your guys' time.